This is Kate Stalker interviewing Doug Wood on June 24th, 2019. Thanks for coming, Doug.
You bet.
Tell me why you'd like to share your story.
So, I think it's a really cool project. Why I want to tell my story, I mean, I've been in Monona since 1984, 85, and been involved in city government for most of that time. So I think I know a lot about the history, but I just find these oral history projects, when I've done a little historical research myself, that find them fascinating to go back and see firsthand accounts of people who are no longer around. And so that's basically it.
Great. Let's start with when you were little. When and where were you born?
I was actually born in St. Louis, Missouri on April 29th, 1957. Actually grew up in Mount Vernon, Illinois, which is a small city of about 17,000 people, about 80 miles from St. Louis. But for anything important, my parents always wanted to go to St. Louis for the big city doctors.
Sure. Big family, little family?
Big family. There were 5 of us, sister, and three brothers. So 5 counting myself, and I am the youngest, so still the baby.
Still the baby?
Sometimes.
So tell me about your parents and grandparents.
So my father was an accountant. He had an accounting business there in Mount Vernon, and my mother worked for him part-time, or depending on what time of the year it was. He would sort of disappear in January and reappear in April after the tax season was over. So he was gone most evenings through the winter and part of the spring. I don't know, it was a happy family. We did spend a lot of time going to St. Louis, went to a lot of St. Louis Cardinal baseball games. My maternal grandfather Anderson was a huge baseball fan and got me into playing baseball, which I played until I was about 15. I think was the last year I played.
So Cardinals or Brewers now?
Brewers. Yeah.
It took
a long time to convert. I mean, in 1982, when they played in the series, I was definitely still a Cardinals fan then.
That's tough.
Yeah.
So how did your childhood influence your life?
Well, I think I was really fortunate, and maybe didn't realize it at the time, but kind of see that and seeing how other people's childhoods may have affected their lives. It was a very supportive family. My mother, I know, she was an adherent of Dr. Spock, not Mr. Spock, Dr. Spock. It was a very positive, very supportive family. Continues to be. They both long passed away, but and it's helped me deal with some things I've gone through, and just kind of have built-in inner resiliency, I think.
How about school?
School?
Did you like school?
Yeah, I did for the most part, except music. I never liked music.
Listening or playing?
Either. Well, listening I like, but music classes.
So when did you come to Monona?
1985, or no, 84. When was it?
And what brought you here?
We'd lived and we moved. Actually, my wife and I moved from Illinois to Madison for me to go to law school and for her to go to graduate school in labor relations, never intending that we would stay. And then her program was a 2-year program, and law school's 3. So when she got out, she got a good job. And even though I swore after being the first winter of being here, I was like, no way, this is nuts. Like, I'd never been anywhere where it snowed in November and you didn't see the ground again until March. But, here I am all these years later. So anyway, we'd lived in an apartment downtown and then a flat on the east side, and we just had a child and we're looking for a home, and it just happened to be in Monona. It wasn't, in fact, I was not real happy about it at first, and it was like, well, no, I wanted to stay in Madison. I didn't know anything about Monona. It wasn't, but anyway, it was a good house for us, and so yeah.
Are you still in that house?
No. We stayed there about 6 years, and then we moved to a house on Thunderbird Lane, the old Craco house, which that will mean something to a very few people out there. He was a concrete contractor, so we had a great basement. Never had to worry about that.
And so you had opportunities when you switched houses to leave Monona, and you didn't. Why?
Right. Well, actually, when we moved, I was on the city council. Although that's still, there have been people who've moved, and I think by that time, I was really liked living here. It was, sort of you get the benefits of being in the larger metro area and being close to downtown, and we have easier access to downtown than a lot of people who live in the city. But it really is a smaller, it's its own community. It's just, 8,000 people or so. And so I think it's easier to get involved and have an impact.
Yeah. So tell me about raising children in Monona. Tell me about your family. Did you have pets? Were they in sports, activities you did together?
Right. Actually, before I answer that, I wanted to go back. The reason I mentioned that our house was the Craco house is that, and I think this is still the case, that people will refer to houses by who used to live there, even if it was like 30 years ago, like 2 or 3 owners ago. But,
Small town.
right. So family, we had 5 children, 4 girls and a boy. And let's see, the first, Jessica was born in 1984, and then Lindsay in 86, another Brittany in 88, Lacey in 89, and Tyler in 92. And the one thing I said I was going to talk about a little bit was that in 1987, on June 5th, I got a call at work at the end of the day that there'd been a terrible accident and I needed to get to the hospital. And my daughter a car had rolled over her at their daycare, and I got there just the same time the ambulance did, but they were not. Her brain was swelling too much, and they couldn't stop it.
I'm so sorry. That's a tragedy that changes your life, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it doesn't. It's not. It's not something anymore that I live with day to day. But if I stop and think about it, I still can very easily get emotional and tear up, and so
Yeah, I'm sure. So what kinds of things did you do together as a family?
Um, we traveled a fair amount. We were big on car trips, so looking back on it, and even my own kids will say we were nuts, but because we'd pile however many we had at the time, we'd pile them all in the car and drive halfway across the country.
Oh yeah. Well, it's good to make good memories after battles.
Right.
So road trips, that was your
Road trips, yeah, but also shorter things. Just trips spent a lot of time in state parks, and later we'd gone to Door County every summer for a long weekend for quite a few years, and it just had gotten so crowded and it was expensive. The sort of looking at a map basically and saw the Apostle Islands and decided to make a trip up there. And I think maybe it was the second time that we went, we ended up putting in an offer to buy a house. And so we had a second house just outside of Bayfield. So that was obviously became a big focal point of family activities.
Oh, great. So did you go to Monona festivals with your kids?
Oh yeah, mainly the 4th of July festival, and that was when they were growing up. We didn't have as many other things going on in the community, like the concert in the park series, and that didn't exist. But yeah, we always went down for the carnival rides and the fireworks.
Do you still go without them?
Yes, we do. Well, I now have a second family. I got divorced about 7 years ago, and so now I have a 15-year-old and stepdaughter and 9-year-old stepson. So, but I actually live across the street from the library at the top of the hill, so we can actually sit in our front yard and see the fireworks from there.
Oh, convenient.
Yeah.
Convenient. I'd like to talk to you about the changes in your neighborhood over the time you've been here and the changes you've seen in businesses coming and going. But given that you are an alder, we should perhaps talk about your role in some of the changes you've seen,
right,
and how you feel about them.
Okay. So I served on the city council from 1989 to 1993, and then got off for 10 years, sort of while my kids were growing up, and got back on in 2003. The first 4 years was a very different experience than it is now. It was a much more conservative city council, with a more conservative mayor. Dick Litchfield was the mayor at the time. It was always interesting. But we did do some really positive things then. We built the pool. I was going to call it the new pool, but it's not so new. I think it was opened in 1993. Instituted recycling, which I sort of spearheaded that. It was kind of what I ran on. I was sort of this guy who came out of nowhere that nobody knew who I was, and ran for city council and won. So,
wow.
And then at that time there were two of us on the council who we would call ourselves liberals, I guess, at the time, or progressives. So.
And how was the recycling received?
Very well, I think.
Yes.
I mean, it took a while to sort of figure out how we were going to do it and work out, some of the practicalities of, like, we started out with a large open bin that had dividers in it for, like, bottles were supposed to go in one and plastic in another and so forth, and that didn't really work that well. But yeah, I think it was something people wanted. So then, when I got back on in 2003, it was still a very divided, kind of partisan city council. We had three of us who definitely were on the left side of things, and two who definitely were not, and were also politically active in other ways. And a brand new mayor, Rob Call, was the mayor for his first term, and it's been, somebody said it's, or they referred to it as the Monday night fights that they would tune in to watch. So we had really long meetings. We didn't necessarily, we accomplished a lot. I shouldn't say that we didn't. We did accomplish things. It just took a long time to do it, and sort of everybody had to have their say, and then when somebody else had their say, people wanted to respond to that, and so.
Yes. Was it televised at the time?
Yes. Yep.
Oh boy. Wonder if those are still around.
Right.
So what made you want to become involved in city government?
Well, I've always been interested in politics and in government, and that's, I think, what sort of somehow at a very early age, I can remember in third grade wanting to be a lawyer, and was very interested in, not then, but later, in the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, sort of, grew up or became politically aware sort of in the time when Richard Nixon was president, and followed Watergate very closely, and actually watched the special Senate committee's hearings on TV. I had one of my older brothers was very influential in that. He was very politically active. He went to SIU Carbondale and was real active in the anti-war movement there. So I think that made me interested in getting involved in local government. And then I think, once I got involved in it, I was able to see over something I learned, I guess, over time too, is that you have an ability, to really affect a lot of the things that impact the quality of life for people, that you don't really have necessarily at a higher level in politics. I was, recruited one time to run for the state assembly, and it was actually by Chuck Qualla, who was in the state senate at the time. But Chuck, I have a job that, I work for the state. I can't be in the state senate and work for the state. You guys don't make any money. And
Tell us about your job with the state.
I've got a family. So yeah, I worked for, originally called the Office of the Commissioner of Transportation, became the Office of the Commissioner of Railroads in 1994, and I focused I worked there for almost 30 years, and almost entirely doing railroad regulation, railroad safety, railroad highway crossing safety primarily. So traveled the entire state pretty much. If there is a railroad in town, I've been there, because we would always, if there was a complaint or a hearing, we would always go to that location. So it was, which was a lot of fun for quite a few years. It eventually got kind of old. So I tried not to have overnight trips and that kind of thing, because I, stayed in enough Best Westerns and Super 8s, and to last a lifetime. So
and it couldn't have been easy to do the the job as Alder at the same time you're traveling.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially then, because well, obviously we had the internet the second time I was on, but I don't recall. I don't know when we really got remote access to our email, but it wasn't. Now you've got a smartphone and it's just all right there if you want to.
Yeah, how has being an Alder changed with the internet? I imagine that's much different. You don't have to wait for a meeting to learn things.
Yeah, it is a lot easier, to communicate, find out. All of our materials we get them electronically now. One thing you would have to be cautious about is not including too many people in an email, because you could be violating the open meetings law if you're not careful. So just in general, don't include more than a quorum of people. But I think one of the biggest changes is it's made city government much more transparent, and people have way more access. I mean, it's like from being very difficult, I think, to find out what was happening in city government. I mean, you would either have to go to the meetings, read the minutes. You could watch them on cable TV. You could read in the local paper what was going on, but that was about the extent of it. And now pretty much everything we do is on the website. We have all sorts of studies that have been done that are accessible. People can sign up for alerts for particular departments, or not even alerts, but newsletters, telling you there's a Parks Board meeting coming up. And yet, there are a lot of people who think it's not transparent enough, which I think probably reflects a generational divide, perhaps, that younger people just, of course, you should have all that on there, and it should be, it should be more, and it should be faster, and more of a desire by people to have their voice heard in what we're doing.
That's a big change. So what have been some of your biggest challenges?
Well, obviously the biggest challenge is always the budget. If you don't get something that you want to do in the budget, then it's just sort of an idea. Putting it in a budget makes it real. Let's see. Well, one of the more interesting challenges, I think, that I was involved in when I first got back on the council in 2003, I had run on and spearheaded the effort to build the skate park, which is now down here at the bottom of the hill in the city center. And I was able to get money for most of it in the city budget. We did do some fundraising as well, but then people didn't. There were a lot of people who thought it should not be put in the Winnequa Park in the middle of the city. They wanted it at Ahuska Park because they thought there would be bad elements and kids smoking and so forth, bad language, which there is some of that, no doubt. But it just made so much more sense to have it here where the kids who were going to use it could get there without having to cross major streets. But yeah, I always said, well, the police station is literally at the top of the hill and they, can keep an eye on things. And there have been, of course, there have been a few problems, but it's really worked well. And from where I live now, I can hear the sort of clickety-clack of the kids using their skateboards on it in the evening. So it's not too disruptive.
Good. So tell me about your campaign and how do you campaign? And you've been doing it for so long. You've had lots of campaigns now.
Right.
Do you have an army of people? Do you use social media?
So when the first ran, I mean, I've always done my own campaigns mostly myself, but at some point you do need help, in particular the last week or 10 days because you want to get out at least a piece of literature to every residence or every residence that's voted. I mean, you get the voting list and but so I have not used social media. I haven't actually had a contested race in like 8 years, maybe 10, which is not really. I mean, for me personally, it's it's a good thing. I don't have to go out and do a lot of work, but it's not really that healthy for the. I think it'd be better if there were always contested races. And the way our council is structured is that three of us we are all six at large, and three of us run every year. So, which I think being at large is a lot better. For one thing, it's too small of a community to try to carve it up into districts, and I know there are other places that do that, and they have a hard time finding anybody to even run. So. But social media nowadays, the most effective way is to actually get out, and walk the streets, and knock on doors, and you also learn a lot about the community when you're like at ground level, walking through a neighborhood instead of driving through it.
Sure. Sure. So, what are some of your greatest accomplishments? What are the things you're most proud of?
Well, let's see. Probably the one thing that comes to mind in particular is when I was on the excuse me, I was on the Parks Board beginning in 2003, and before I got elected that time, I had gone around and to all the city parks and taken photos of them, and actually posted. I had a blog at the time. So I posted the photos on my blog because most of the playground equipment was really pretty abysmal. No money had been spent on it in years. And so I led the effort to get money in the capital budget sufficient to replace the playground equipment at one park in each year, and which then other park board members, other alders I just got back on Parks Board, but I've continued that. And so we've worked our way through all the parks that have playground equipment, have had it replaced. And now some of them needed to have it replaced again, but that's the nature of.
I suppose that doesn't end.
Right. And I think and my own kids have come back and see the parks and, are like kind of amazed at how much improvement there's been in the parks, and not just the playground equipment, but we've built several park shelters, a new bathroom house at Schluter Beach with a bike repair station. Just the parks, I think, are really a jewel of the city.
You can't underestimate how attractive that is to a family thinking of moving to Monona.
Right.
So I'm sure it's appreciated. So what's been your greatest disappointment in public service in Monona?
So I guess I'd identify two. One would be we attempted to pass an ordinance to allow people to keep chickens in their backyard, and it failed. I can't remember if it was 4-2 or if it was a tie vote, and so it failed because it didn't have a majority. But which has not stopped people from having chickens in their backyards. That was the problem with that, as you can tell just by your reaction here and mine too, is as soon as you talk about it, it's like funny, and it's really hard to ever get past that, the funny part of it. But a more serious, bigger disappointment, I guess, was back in the 80s. This was actually right before I got on city council, and I suppose had something to do with my interest in it. There was an Indian mound, burial mound, located on the north end of Monona Drive, and the property was for sale, and so there was a community effort I was sort of involved in on the fringes of it to raise money to purchase the property, to preserve the mound, but also to preserve the area around it. And there was an ad hoc committee that made a recommendation that the city should step up and help raise the money. But the city council at the time decided not to do that. So the city did not buy it. The mound is still there, but there is a house built fairly close to it. So that was obviously a disappointment. That helped lead to the passage of a state law protecting burial mounds, and that was actually the first burial mound cataloged by the Historical Society. And we're going to be doing a dedication ceremony of a new state historic marker sometime later this summer. So it took a long time to get there.
Yeah, but you're here to see it.
Right?
Yeah.
I should just mention one other really positive thing that I was involved in to some extent, but really was led by John Traver, was the purchase of the land that is now Woodland Park and the Aldo Leopold Nature Center property. In, well, let's see, 1993, it was proposed to be sold and developed as condominiums, and John sort of led the effort that he ran for city council solely on that issue, and that the development was never approved by the plan commission, and eventually there was a referendum held asking the citizens whether we should spend $1.5 million, I think, dollars at the time, of city money to buy the land, which passed 2-1, and it eventually was purchased and became Woodland Park and the Nature Center.
Well, that's a wonderful story. Now it's protected.
Right.
So tell me about changes in Monona, in your neighborhood, for example, or with the businesses on Monona Drive and Broadway.
Yeah. So I don't know that I identify too many changes in my neighborhood or the couple of neighborhoods I've lived in, other than turnover of the street I used to live on was a cul-de-sac with about 7 houses on it, but I think there's only 1, maybe 2 people who still live there, who lived there in the time I was there. The biggest changes the residential area has been the tear down of existing housing, single-family housing, and replacing it with much larger, more modern, nicer, bigger properties, especially along Taniwatha Trail. Very large, huge, you would say, mansions built along there, which is finding a way. Although I mean, I still remember when there were not quite fishing shacks. I mean, but more than that, but very simple, ordinary homes on that stretch of the lakefront, and I don't think any of those remain. And it's happened to a little bit in the interior of the city. We have some parts that have very long, deep, large lots, and those similar things have happened there. Not that the new homes aren't to the extent that you would see, on the lake. Obviously, those it what am I trying to say? It revitalizes the housing stock, but obviously, it also increases the values and the sale prices. That's probably been one of the biggest changes is the expense of buying a home in Monona. Not even, just a basic home. I think the median price is around $250,000 now. I think actually probably, I'm sure now by now that number has gone up. Business developments, I think when we rebuilt Monona Drive, that has helped to revitalize some of that. There's still some challenges there, but if you look at photographs of what the drive looked like before and now, and I think when it was there, you didn't even really realize all the power lines that were just sort of hovering over the street, which are all underground now. We've had a couple of major residential developments. The one Tresta on the water, a couple of new clinic. UW and Merritt both built clinics. Those are all TIF projects. And currently we're doing the riverfront development, which I think has been controversial with litigation and has taken many hours. But we're now at the point, I think, if we're going to start enjoying the fruits of all that effort. So
Yeah, it looks close.
yeah, and again, it's sort of one of those things. If you recall what it looked like before and what it will be, it's obviously going to be a huge plus for the city.
Mm-hmm. So, given the changes that you've seen, what community issues do you anticipate in the future?
Well, I think it'll be interesting to see how the community changes as the demographics continue to change. I think we're still the oldest community age-wise, in Dane County, but we've seen a lot more turnover and younger families moving in. I think there's sort of a trend for people who may live on the east side who are looking for a little more room to raise a family with a yard and so forth are moving here, and it's definitely changing sort of the feel of the city and what they want versus what older generations might have asked for. So that's. And I think, we have a great park and rec director who has really responded to that with lots of programs, the pop-up beer gardens, the huge expansion of our rec program offerings that used to be pretty minimal, to now year-round, multiple offerings of all sorts of things for all sorts of tastes.
Great. Winding down, what is the one thing you most want people to remember about you in the future? How do you want to be remembered?
Oh, I think, mainly I want to be remembered by my family as somebody who cared about them. I guess an extension of that to some ways is to be remembered as somebody who cared about the community and was willing to work to accomplish things. But I've always tried to also be open to different viewpoints, and I think my experience in my job I was an administrative law judge, and so sort of listened to two sides of things, and it was amazing, as I think this extends into life, of when you only heard the first side of the story, you could form one opinion, and then you heard the other side and you realized the facts didn't necessarily mesh up, or they were emphasizing different facts. But anyway, yeah, I think as someone who cared about the community.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for coming in and being interviewed.
Well,
We
thank
appreciate
you.
it. Thanks.
Yep.